Yeah, I named you after the 16th president.
All right, Chris Peaks here tonight, my friend Chris. Been a while since we had a Civil War chat. He's always one of my favorite people to discuss it with, and glad to have him back. Thanks for coming back on, Chris. How you been, man?
Good.
Good.
Just enjoying Friday night. Things are nice.
Good. So, this is a anniversary of a Civil War campaign that was very pivotal in the outcome of the war, the Maryland campaign.
Yes.
So, Lee's just came off a huge victory at Second Manassas. What's his plan then? Why go to Maryland? I mean, is he striking for a victory to end the war?
I mean, he's always looking for a battle. I mean, any astute military analyst at the beginning of the Maryland campaign knows a major battle's in the offing. But whether or not the Union wants to fight that in Maryland or in Boston, this is really up to them. My understanding, I'm trying to remember, basically Lee's goals are, like, Lee's number one goal from 1862 really until Gettysburg in that 9-month, 11-month kind of golden era, is to maintain the initiative against the Federals to prevent them from coordinating their forces at any particular center of gravity. At least in the case of Virginia, to prevent them from mobilizing their full war machine. He also constantly has the elections on his mind. The fact that it's September of 1862 and the congressional elections are November of 1862 is not lost upon Lee. Ironically, from what I know, and I'm taking this from McPherson, I think, Lee doesn't seem to have ever, and I could be wrong, but Lee doesn't seem to have really held a great deal of confidence in foreign recognition, despite nearly achieving it. So as far as I know, that wasn't really his goal. As far as I know, his goals essentially were prevent the Federals from mobilizing for a fall offensive. Remember, the Federals had now withdrawn from the Urbana, so that threat.
Let me ask you a quick question right quick before we get ahead and forget this. So, in your opinion, Lee felt that the Confederacy had to win that war on their own and could not rely on foreign help. It was their war. They had to win it. Okay.
Yeah, and Davis will get there eventually as well. From what I know, and again, this is secondhand. From what I know, Lee doesn't seem to have ever really expressed a clear hope of European intervention. Which again is terribly ironic because he couldn't have known this, but Palmerston had decided that the Maryland campaign should decide the issue, at least for the time being, and Lee came within a hair's breadth of achieving it. What Lee believed essentially was the federal war machine was a sluggish thing, but could mobilize enough strength to make victory inevitable. So what the South needed to do was to mobilize its entire force and strike hard, critical blows to prevent the Federals from mobilizing and directing their entire force as one unified strategy, winning signal victories until either home front support was exhausted, or, if possible, winning a signal victory that could lead to successful negotiations. Now, what Lee did believe in very strongly were friends in the North. In the, I can't remember if this is the Maryland or the Gettysburg campaign. I think it's the Gettysburg campaign. He will write to Davis explaining, I'm paraphrasing, but groups like the Knights of the Golden Circle or Heroes of America, these pro-peace at any cost parties. They weren't pro-Confederate per se, saying, look, they want peace with reunification. We want peace with separation. There's no need to stress to them the differences in our opinion. They're helping us. So we should, and the Confederacy would directly send money to these organizations and even to the Democrats in the election of 64, if I recall, secretly, of course. But his point was, let them believe that in a peace negotiation, we can have reunification. It doesn't hurt us for them to think that. Whatever sows essentially discord amongst the Federals. And Lee constantly stressed, well, not constantly, but often stressed this idea of influencing the elections of 1862 and 1864, or even the gubernatorials of 63. So I think what Lee was hoping for was he wanted to rally Confederate unity, because that was one of the Confederacy's primary weaknesses, is you have 11 states who are only vaguely working together. And he wanted to divide the North against itself.
He understood the political and military ramifications, is what you're saying.
Hugely, yeah. And he was banking on it, which I think is a good strategy. Arguably better than looking for foreign recognition. The thing about Lee is, I mean, I think Grant's the best general of the war. I'm only a little biased, but I think you can make the case Grant and then Sherman. But the thing about Lee is Lee's becoming a whipping boy right now because the Confederacy is becoming such a, rightfully unpopular thing. But I really think Lee actually was pretty brilliant. And I think his view of the war wasn't wrong. It just didn't work, if that makes any sense.
Whose idea was the Maryland campaign? Was it his or Davis's?
Lee's by a long shot. He didn't even ask Davis's permission. Davis categorically would have opposed the operation. He quite literally sends to Davis a letter saying, okay, so we're going to go into the North. I've already started. If this isn't okay, let me know. But otherwise, we're good. And Davis never responds, which for Lee is permission to go ahead. I'm borrowing a lot from Stephen Woodsworth here, who is one of my favorite campaign and operational historians. But essentially, the difference between Lee and Davis is that Lee believed in a sharp, aggressive war that was essentially based on gambling. The best way to actually express it is the way he sold the Maryland campaign in this letter to Davis, where he basically says, well, I recognize that the operations might result in the entire destruction of our army. I do not believe that victory is impossible. Great. But we might not get destroyed. Awesome. That sounds insane. As compared to Davis, who believed in being very conservative in strategy, occasionally giving up ground in order to maintain a defense, and allowing the Federals take the initiative and train themselves against Confederate defenses. And as I'm saying this, you're probably thinking, that sounds a lot like Joseph E. Johnston. And that's because it is a lot like Joseph E. Johnston. But the problem is, Johnston and Davis had an appallingly bad working relationship, whereas Lee and Davis had a phenomenal working relationship, but they had totally adversarial strategies. And one of the problems that the Confederacy has in the war is that Davis and Lee are rarely actually in accordance at a grand strategic level about how to win this thing, but the Confederacy never develops a grand strategy at all. So it's this soft tug of war between Davis and Lee. The book I'm reading right now, I dip into it every now and then. Someday I'm going to finish it. Davis and Lee at War. This is the essential thesis of the film, of the book, is that the two, despite forming an effective administrative partnership, nevertheless were in a tug of war itself over the conduct of the war. And the Maryland campaign is the perfect example of this. Davis was reluctant to even dispatch troops to fight at Second Manassas. And Lee has to kind of slowly convince him to dispatch more and more troops, leaving less and less to hold McClellan and the Urbana until he has a concentration sufficient enough to actually drive back Pope. Even that was too much for Davis. And now all of a sudden Lee is going into Maryland with a
how many troops did he have?
Sorry?
How many troops did he have when he started the march?
I think at the Battle of Antietam, he has 40,000. He had more than that going into Maryland, but I don't know the number offhand. But he had 40,000.
That was always the question. Going in, I think it was 38. Why was he going for this offensive with those few troops?
He's a gambler.
Now, I've heard that he was hoping for a huge influx of volunteers.
Yeah. So among Lee's goals are one, back to the goals issue, to suspend federal operations in the Virginia theater for the remainder of the year, which he almost pulls off. There will be a fight at Fredericksburg, but it goes pretty well for the Confederates, not for my side. Second, he hoped that he could resupply his army in Maryland, which he said he would do, but then as soon as he actually got into Maryland, he was asking for supplies, so that didn't quite pan out. 3, to raise recruits in Maryland. 4, that Maryland would join the Confederacy, because the belief generally was Maryland was held in the Union by force. And 5, perhaps to propose an armistice for negotiations with Lincoln. And a letter was dispatched for this as well, not just for the Gettysburg campaign, which is much more famous. There was a letter for the same purpose prepared for Maryland. Interestingly, as I recollect, Lee actually proposed to Davis to send the letter before a major action, and Davis's response was, "We're probably going to fight a battle, so why don't we wait till after?" Which is smart.
Let me ask you one question. Sorry, I mean to cut you off. Let me ask you a question. Is this not, a bad idea to think, okay, I'm going to invade a state and they're going to rally around me when I bring the war on their soil?
Well, I mean, if you will, I think they'll greet us as liberators. I mean, it's not a new mistake and it's not an old mistake, right?
Okay.
One of the biggest mistakes that Lee made is he went into West Maryland. West Maryland had a very small slave-owning population. Now he went into West Maryland because he could use the Blue Ridge Mountain to screen his movement, and then he could also, goodness gracious, I forget which rail line it was, but by using the Blue Ridge Mountains to screen his movement, he could also turn the flank of Harper's Ferry and cut it off from its line of communication, which he believed would compel the garrison to withdraw, which it probably would have been had it not been commanded by someone as stupid as its actual commander, Colonel Miles, who was so imbecilic in his decision-making, and as a Marylander, and therefore at the time a Southerner, it was actually suspected he might be a traitor. Only reason that was never pursued was he was also the last man killed during the siege of Harper's Ferry, which seems to have exonerated him. I don't think he was a traitor. I think he was just totally out of his depth. But he accepted a siege, which is what throws off Lee's entire plan. Lee was supposed to turn the flank at Harper's Ferry, the Federals retreat, and then he can move into Maryland proper. But he's stuck in West Maryland, and West Marylanders don't have a lot of slaves. They're not that interested in supporting the Confederacy.
Right. Like North,
Miles,
in northern Alabama, and those areas. Do you think that his objective was Baltimore?
I mean, I don't have enough knowledge about it to comment on that intelligently. Baltimore is a logical objective, but I don't want to go beyond what I know, and I can't say. Let me put it this way. I mean, if the Federals are offering, I don't know. I don't know offhand if he had an actual, like in the Gettysburg campaign, he wanted to get to Harrisburg. As far as I know, at least. In the Maryland campaign, I don't remember if he wanted Baltimore or not, but if the Federals are offering it, sure, right? But I don't want to. I don't want to talk up my rectum, so to speak.
Another question for you. His orders, 191, whatever. How crucial was that? Did that lay out his entire battle plans? I mean, how crucial was that in the battle? What did they exactly say? Do you know?
Yeah, so basically what Orders 191 said, to paraphrase, is, hey, everyone, I've divided my army into 4 separate forces. Please don't kill me. Basically, what he had done was he had to, since the Harper's Ferry garrison didn't withdraw, he had to dispatch A.P. Hill and Stonewall Jackson in order to capture them while maintaining Longstreet with himself. And I can't remember who else offhand, but was it D.H. Jones? Anyway,
I think it was.
But he essentially had to split the army. And legend has it, this concern was raised to him by Yeah, I don't remember if it was one account. I swear said John B. Gordon, but that seems a little too on the nose. He was only a colonel, so I doubt it. But it was raised to him in this possibly apocryphal story, to which Lee responded to the officer, "Are you acquainted with General McClellan?" Basically implying, yeah, if we were fighting anybody else, this would probably be pretty risky, but it's McClellan. We'll have time. He counted on McClellan moving as slowly as he did on the Urbana. When McClellan is given the orders, he knows Lee is divided. McClellan is able to attack within a few days. For McClellan, that's practically mercurial. If the attack had been launched sooner, maybe it would have been more successful. But what happens is Lee is forced to deploy in the South Mountain as a defensive measure and fight a desperate battle. And then he has to find a defensive line behind South Mountain, and that's going to be Sharpsburg. It's not necessarily where he wanted to fight, but it's the best ground he could find. So the orders are totally consequential to the campaign. It changes everything because it gives the Federals a significant opportunity to annihilate Lee's army in detail, and failing that, it gives them the initiative, and now Lee has to fight reactively, which is exactly what he didn't want to do. What he wanted to do was find ground of his own choosing, take it, and offer battle to the Federals. Instead, he has to take what's available, which is a good position, but not a phenomenal one. So and that's what gives us one of the bloodiest battles of the war.
Sorry. If memory serves me right, and sometimes I forget, McClellan had around 80,000 to Lee's 38.
Well, yeah, more or less, but he only ever had 46,000 deployed at any one time.
Yeah, he never put in his forces in. So let's talk about the battle a bit. Can you discuss that?
I mean, not really intelligently, but in broad strokes.
So it started off as the fight at the peach orchard or the wheat field?
So there's some skirmishing at Nicodemus Hill. Basically, it kind of runs down the line right to left. And McClellan's original strategy, according to Burnside, I got to get back to reading it. No, it wasn't Burnside. Sorry, it was General Cox who wrote. I can't remember if it was Cox or Burnside. One of them wrote it. No, it was Burnside for Century Magazine. Abe, are you good? All right, you're good. Abraham, when you stand and walk around like that, you make me anxious. Do you have to pee? You have to pee? Good?
You can take him out. I can.
I may have to.
Yeah.
So, I'm gonna mess this up. I'm terrible at the spatial stuff in the war, but according to Burnside, the original plan essentially was Burnside would hold the Confederate right at the North Bridge, which was easily the most defensible portion of Lee's line, given that the Antietam Creek was in front of it and you were bottlenecked by the bridge. And then McClellan would attack the Confederate right and center, looking to break the line. And once the line was broken, then Burnside could move across the creek and could strike the left. Burnside would then alter this after the battle and pretend that the left was actually the Confederate left was going to be carried, which, as Burnside pointed out, was absurd. Why on earth would you rely upon your primary attack to be against a creek at a bottleneck? But what ultimately happens is a series of barely coordinated offensives. My understanding, in large part, because McClellan insisted, Abe, stop scratching. Abe.
Hey, before you get to that, let me ask you one question. Why did Burnside spend so much time on that bridge when it was ankle deep water?
It wasn't. During the battle, it was much larger. It was too much to ford.
The water was too much for. Okay, so that's just a misnomer that's been spread because
that's my understanding. It was quite high. I mean, look, people tend
Dunkirk Church. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I was going to say something.
Burnside's a bit of a whipping boy, but he wasn't a moron. They needed to take the bridge, is what it came down to.
Dunkirk Church, was that the heaviest fighting?
As far as I remember, it's the Dunkirk Church at Miller's Cornfield, really, which Dunkirk Church was kind of the landmark that they were aiming for. But Yeah, the Miller's Cornfield is the worst of it. Most of the casualties in the battle are at the Miller's Cornfield. And that's
where
the first few action.
Bloody Lane was that?
Bloody Lane is beside Miller's Cornfield. So, and if anybody is walking this, I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher this, but in its simplest terms, you have the Eastwood and the Westwood, and then you have the Miller's Cornfield, and then I think you have the Sherfy's Farm and the Otto Schreck Farm, and then you have the Bloody Lane, which is the sunken road, and then you have, I'm sure I've butchered this in 100 ways at this point because I don't know this off by heart. And then you have the North Bridge. So basically, it's kind of a right to left thing. Which, yeah, it was brutal. But the thing is, there's no coordination, in part because McClellan insisted on controlling every part of it himself, which is asinine. The armies are too large for that level of command and control. But this was always McClellan's problem. This is the same man who desperately resisted creating corps. At the same time, Lee was urging Davis to create corps. Because with armies of this size, you just can't control them, especially with 19th century communication technology, technology being a horse. So,
yeah, because the battle was changed. Yeah. That's something else I wanted to ask you, get your opinion on. McClellan launched these uncoordinated attacks. Kind of reminds me of Bastogne, Belgium, 100 years later. Do you feel like that? Because I feel like that, we talk about Lee tactically, that this was one of his finest moments, the way he shifted his forces around to meet each attack.
You know what it is? If I can be a little edgy here, it's sure. Gettysburg is Antietam in reverse. At Antietam, the Federals are uncoordinated. Some corps commanders perform brilliantly, but there is a lot of inconsistency. Sumner really, really screws the pooch. Abe, I know you got allergies, honey. Try not to scratch my love. Sumner screws the pooch. Hooker does a pretty fantastic job till he's hit. Mansfield dies immediately. But there's very little coordination between them. Meanwhile, in the rebel forces, the coordination is phenomenal. Everyone's moving troops seamlessly to defend each other and protect each other. And at Gettysburg, you get the reverse. The Confederate Army just did not have it together at Gettysburg. No one seems to be working together. Everyone's at their worst. We don't even know where AP Hill is. He's just vanished on us. And the Federals are working together in perfect coordination. That's part of it. But yeah, as far as I understand it, Lee's movements at Antietam are phenomenal. He moves his, if I was going to paraphrase a wonderful line from the film Waterloo, he moves his troops with the lightness of a pistol, just wherever he needs it.
I think that was his finest moments.
Sorry?
I think that was one of his finest moments, the way he anticipated each attack and shifted his troops.
At a tactical level, at a strategic level, you do have to at a certain point, and I respect what Lee was trying to do strategically, but you do have to ask at a certain point, Robert, do you really want to be here with half the enemy's army? Like with half the, but at a tactical level, yeah, it's incredible. But then remember the cost, right? Hood's division suffers 50% casualties at Miller's Cornfield.
I think that Lee was the greatest tactical general of the war. Any other commander, especially Grant, Sherman, Lee's army would have been destroyed at Sharpsburg that day.
Yeah. If Grant had been commanding the Battle of Antietam, the Civil War would have ended in 1862.
I agree. He would
not have let Lee say like that.
Yeah,
now, to Lee's credit, I don't think Lee would have done something as audacious as the Maryland campaign if Grant had been in command, because Lee was pretty good at reading his opponents. He underestimated Grant to his detriment, but I don't think he would have been so foolish as to commit to the campaign if Grant had been in command. But, regardless, McClellan was in command, and we tend to overlook this fact, but McClellan did win. It's important to remember, he did win. Not masterfully, but he did win.
Let me ask your opinion on this, because here's my take on it. The way Lee tactically, I consider this that Lee actually tactically won the battle, but it was a strategic defeat.
and strategy always trumps tactics. Like it's yeah. You
And
played a
then
great game, but still lost. Okay.
And then McClellan, just to let him escape, it was inexcusable.
Well, he did pursue. I mean, the Battle of Shepherdstown is overlooked, but it was a real thing. In fact, it was actually 20th Maine's first combat was the Battle of Shepherdstown. As far as I know, I couldn't tell you anything about it, but they were likely engaged. This is before Fredericksburg, of course. But Lee, he still escapes. Which is also one of the reasons why the rebels saw Maryland as a victory. Gettysburg was very difficult to spin as a victory. Initially it is, and it doesn't take long before Confederate press is acknowledging, Gettysburg goes from, we've won a tremendous victory at Gettysburg, to we won a limited victory at Gettysburg, to Gettysburg was not great. And then finally, we probably lost. From what I know, Maryland doesn't quite go that direction because if you think about it, the Confederates actually got a lot in Maryland. The Confederates do resupply their army to a greater or lesser extent. They win the Battle of Shepherdstown. At Antietam, they can pretend they can say it was a tactical victory, and Lee did hold the field the next day. So from the honor code system, he can make that claim for whatever it's worth. Now, importantly, the Europeans didn't see it that way, which to me makes everything moot because their opinion is the one that matters. But there's also the slightly awkward fact that they captured 12,000 men at Harper's Ferry. And if you agree with me that General Grant captured 3 armies in the war, one of those armies is Fort Donelson, which is 17,000, which means the 12,000 man garrison Harper's Ferry is also an army. So when people say that Lee never captured an army, I disagree. He did capture one. It was in the Maryland campaign. And when you combine that with the victory at Shepherdstown during the retreat, a lot of rebels saw Maryland as a victory. The problem is Maryland didn't join the Confederacy. Very few Marylanders joined the ranks. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and Palmerston cooled his heels on intervention. So, the Confederates can convince themselves they won, but the Union won. And when it comes to the actual fruits of the campaign, the Union does come out on top. But it's interesting that the Confederates have enough to reasonably believe that they did win. So I don't think Lee ever wins off of that. Oh, and I should also mention the congressional elections of 1862, and I could leave this to folks listening to decide who wins here. The Republicans lost, 25% of their seats in the House? But it's not enough to lose the majority. And it comes back to this thinking of, I call it football thinking. If we're thinking in terms of points, Lee gets more points in the Maryland campaign. Both sides lose about an equal number at the Battle of Antietam, but you can add 12,000 additional effectives lost for the Federals just for Harper's Ferry. And the Republicans lose 25% of their seats in the House. But the Republicans keep the majority, and the Federals drive them out of Maryland, and the Europeans don't intervene. So ultimately, and we get the Emancipation Proclamation. So in terms of points, it looks good for Lee. In terms of outcomes, looks pretty good for the guys who lost, which is why I consider the Antietam campaign to be a pretty clear Union victory, despite some of these significant isolated events.
Okay, a question for you. You said that you don't think Lee actually ever seen it as a victory?
I mean, I don't know for sure. What I do know is Lee was very disappointed in the outcome. And one of the reasons he would decide to move into Pennsylvania, at least McPherson discusses this in his essay on the subject of Lee's invasion of Pennsylvania, was in 1863 when McClellan was presenting his testimony to the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. He explained that his operation at South Mountain were due to the capture of Lee's orders. Now, Lee knew that some intelligence had reached McClellan because McClellan, of course, he was hosting a gathering of Marylanders when he gets the letter, and that's when he famously looks at the page, reads it, and then shouts, "If I cannot whip Bobby Lee with this paper, I am glad to go home." But he never says what that paper is. He's not that foolish. And then he dismisses everyone. Well, one of them was actually a Confederate spy. And they basically inform Lee, no idea what he has, but he's very excited and it sounds like he's going to move, which is when Lee gets the first intimation. I need to start concentrating my defenses now. But it's not until McClellan's testimony that Lee learns that by an extraordinarily unlikely series of events, like, I mean, 1 in a billion odds, it would have been a really dramatic end to the war. It's almost thematically disappointing it didn't end because of this. A federal soldier who literally just walked into the orders. And Lee's conclusion is, that's how they got me. That's not going to happen again. As a point of just interest, the Indiana soldier that did walk into those letters, legend has it, as he was reading the note, and it was said signed Robert E. Lee, he very dispassionately remarked, I've heard of him. But regardless of the legend, the man himself was an Indiana regiment, and it was because of his discovery of this and sending it up the ranks that the Battle of Antietam happened. It's the only time in the Civil War a private causes a battle of that size, and ironically, he's killed there. Just a little aside, the battle he made is his last, but Lee was disappointed by it. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. You can finish your thought.
No, just Lee was disappointed by the outcome, but then he becomes convinced, well, bad luck. Which to an extent it was. I mean, the Maryland campaign would have had a very different character if McClellan had operated as he usually did. Would it have been successful? I mean, at some point, McClellan would have had to have brought Lee to battle. So who knows? I mean, it's impossible to say. But
so McClellan was a great organizer. And this a two-part question here. So why did he only commit half of his forces to the battle?
I'm not going to pretend I know the mind of McClellan. The default answer is McClellan always assumed there were another 300 million Confederate soldiers in reserve. If I had to borrow from Richard Slotkin, whose book Long Road to Antietam is by a wide mile the most influential on my opinions on the campaign, ultimately McClellan believed that he had been set up for failure, and when he was defeated, the black socialist feminist Republicans, with their evil machinations, would free the slaves and make all people equal and all these other horrifying ideas. And so he had to stand firm for the conservative Northerner and save the Republic from something as awful as human equality. So he couldn't lose, and he was terrified to lose. So part of it is he needs to have a huge reserve in case of a Confederate counterattack with phantoms. And then the other part of it is, from what I understand, he had a desperate need to control the situation. Well, one man can't possibly order that many units. So there's a limited number being engaged at any particular time. If I was McClellan, for whatever it's worth, I would have said, Burnside, do whatever you have to do to hold the left. Hooker, you're taking command of the right wing, and your job is to keep assaulting and break through with an attack. And then we're going to move into the center. Once you've pressed them, we move to the center. Wherever they break, that's where the attack happens. And then we turn their lines. And at that point, you sit back and you wait for news. That's the smartest way to fight the Civil War.
When Lee, began his retreat, half his forces still hadn't been engaged, and he didn't throw all of them at him. Do you think in the back of his mind he was scared? Hey, I'm chasing Bobby Lee, and he's just waiting for me to make a mistake. And
oh yeah, McClellan was constantly terrified. Which is why Lincoln sets his test for him in October. I can't remember the details. It was nigh impossible test, but if McClellan doesn't move sufficiently, I'm removing him. Yeah, no, I think McClellan's. And again, this is all comes from Richard Slotkin, but he makes a very convincing argument that fundamentally, McClellan's great fear is that he had been set up for failure. He's deeply narcissistic, man. And I've been set up for failure because I am the only thing that can protect the Republic from the black Republicans. And they want to use their witch hunting joint committee to remove me, but they have to be defeated first. And I, the godlike McClellan, could not possibly be defeated on even terms. So clearly they have sabotaged me. This is all lunacy. Lincoln just wants to win the war.
History is kind of taking a fresh look at McClellan. Is he as bad as what they portrayed him, or maybe not that awful of a general?
I think he was a terrible general, and I could make a defense for him. I think he's a terrible general. I will also say he was one of the most brilliant generals of the war, and he was terrible. And
why was Lee so afraid of him?
Sorry?
Why was Lee so afraid of him?
He wasn't. Lee says in his interview in 1866, when he's asked who was the greatest general you fought, he says General McClellan. BS. This is the same guy who proposed to move almost the entirety. Let me finish. Almost the entirety of the Army of Northern Virginia and Richmond's garrison against General Pope, while McClellan had the entire Army of the Potomac 20 miles from Richmond. No. You don't get to pretend that he was ever a threat to you. You wouldn't move so cavalierly. This is the same man who left a skeleton force to protect Richmond when he hurled his army repeatedly against McClellan and said afterwards, quote, had it under ordinary circumstances, McClellan's army would have been destroyed. He never thought McClellan was a great opponent. The reason he says so after the war is because he's bitter. He doesn't want to admit that Grant is better than him.
I thought he said not that he wasn't the greatest. I thought he said that was the general he feared the most.
Yeah, BS. Absolute BS.
Okay.
And if he did, he's a fool. Because every general, I'd be more afraid of Burnside because Burnside will actually attack. I'd be more afraid of Hooker because Hooker actually stole the march on Lee at Chancellorsville. And he did. Lee was practically off of Gordonsville.
McClellan.
And if he wasn't afraid of Grant after the Wilderness, then Lee is a much dumber person than I give him credit for.
Do you think that McClellan was reluctant to attack from what he witnessed during the Crimean War?
I don't know. Maybe. But I find Slotkin's argument.
He couldn't stomach casualties.
Yeah, I find Slotkin's argument. I mean, people have speculated left and right. I think Slotkin nails it. I think McClellan had a Messiah complex. Well, I think. Slotkin thinks, I agree, that McClellan had a Messiah complex. And he believed he was the savior of the Union from radical leftism. And he wouldn't call it that then, but we call it that now. And that when he was defeated in battle, the radical black Republicans could do as they would. So he believed that the Lincoln administration was setting him up for failure. And he was more interested in fighting the war against Lincoln than the war against the Confederates, because as a hard right conservative, frankly, he had more in common with the Confederates, right? This is the same guy who writes the Harrison Landing letter, right at the same time Lincoln is writing the Emancipation Proclamation. And right after his pathetic defeat in the Urbana campaign, which should have ended the war, McClellan has the audacity to lecture Lincoln on policy, and his letter outlines every single thing Lincoln wasn't going to do. Among other things, saying the war must be fought on the highest Christian virtues and the property of our enemies must not be threatened. So he's basically saying you have to overturn the Confiscations Act. Lincoln is about to write the Emancipation Proclamation, right? McClellan was out of his gourd, but he really believed he was fighting to preserve the Christian, white, conservative values of the North. And he became more obsessed with that than winning the war, which is what makes him the worst general on the Union side. It's not that he lacked for brilliance. He was absolutely stone cold brilliant. He was a genius. The problem with McClellan, he was also a delusional narcissist. And he had a total inability to appreciate the relationship of civilian command to military strategy. Clausewitz, in his work, I'm going to paraphrase, he basically says military brilliance is nice, but temperament is what matters. Grant had both. McClellan had only one. And having military brilliance without having the right temperament isn't that useful, because it means that you will not follow orders, you will not follow national policy, and ultimately you're unreliable. So McClellan, I think he was one of the most brilliant generals of the war and one of the worst. It makes him very fascinating. He's incredibly interesting. Yeah, but I'm not going to sing his praises.
I want to ask you a question, touch on something you mentioned earlier about a letter of peace. I mean, do you think they were going there to, try to get an armistice, deliver a letter of peace to Lincoln before they ever came to battle? out of uh, threat and public, outcry against the war? I mean, what do you think was going through their mind there? Because you're going in there
Well,
with 40,000 men, you're not going to get a significant victory.
I think Lee believed remember what Lee said to President Locke, go through all the names. What he said to President Davis. I do not believe victory is impossible, right? Which is Lee's sign of endorsement. I think Lee thought he could win. I think Lee underestimated how many men would fall out during the invasion of Maryland. I swear I was reading about these numbers recently, but I've forgotten all of it. But what I vaguely remember is he was shocked, as everyone was, by how rapidly the army dissolved across the Potomac. He also didn't. He also assumed the Federals, that the Harpers Ferry garrison would withdraw, allowing him to maintain the initiative. He also believed that McClellan would move far slower. All of these assumptions were wrong. As for an armistice would have been a godsend of the Confederacy. It would have been a godsend at any point in the war, because an armistice means the Federals have to suspend their war machine. The Confederates can recover, they can resupply, reorganize. And if the negotiations fail, which they will, because on the basis of separation, there really can be no negotiation, the Federal war machine has to restart. The Confederates don't. All they have to do is just sit tight. And it's much harder to restart. My favorite example of that was Hampton Roads. As far as I know, it was the last time the Confederates proposed such an armistice. And they couldn't get anywhere with Lincoln, and they keep recommending, okay, can we have an armistice? Can we negotiate? No. Well, finally, Justice Campbell says, well, can we negotiate? If we can negotiate here, can we at least suspend operations during the negotiations? And Lincoln says no. And Justice Campbell, in frustration, responds, even King Charles I suspended operations during negotiations. And Lincoln responded, as one historian said, probably with a twinkle in his eye, I don't claim to be posted very well in history. All I know about King Charles I is they cut off his head.
Oh, my God. Okay, I got another question to ask you. That fits into Lee's personality. As aggressive as he was, go for the jugular type guy, do you think after Second Manassas, he smelled blood in the water and he thought, I can land a knockout blow right here if I win a battle?
What happens if he forces, what happens if instead of the Republicans losing 25% of their seats, let's say it's 40%? What happens if Lincoln is a lame duck president? How is he going to appropriate funds for the war if the Peace Party has more power in Congress? That alone is a huge victory, right? He doesn't, I don't think, if you're asking me, does Lee see his army marching into Washington? No. At no point was that possible.
Winning a battle in Maryland and turning public sentiment.
Yes.
Maryland coming in very much on the side. Yes. That Lee smelled victory, that he said, I've just won two major this major campaign, and I've got them on the ropes, blood's in the water, it's time to go for the jugular.
More than that, we tend to always forget in this calculus is, where was the Federal Army in June, like May 31st, 1862? It's 20 miles from Richmond. Right. And then as of August 30th, the rebels are 20 miles from Washington, D.C. That's pretty amazing, right? Now, it was at extraordinary cost, but that's amazing. So, yeah, Lee has reason to believe he has shown the North that they can't win this war, right? And internationally, this was a huge problem. In 62, Lincoln was bemoaning to one of his French sympathizers, we've taken so much territory in the West, no one seems to care about that. People only care about the East. So Lee had a point that it was possible to exhaust the home front morale.
Let me ask you this. I've always seen 1862 is the Confederate high water mark as far as the advancement of their armies. Do you feel that Sharpsburg was a bigger loss than Gettysburg? Because they were closer to victory then as they were in 1863? Because by 1863, the war was going so bad against them.
I mean, I think that's a really cool question. We're playing with counterfactuals because by saying we're close to victory, we have to presuppose that we know what events would lead to Confederate victory, which of course we don't. But in 1862, they have a hell of a lot to win at Maryland. They also gained a lot more and lost a lot less. Lee's losses are nowhere near as high as they are at Gettysburg. Percentage-wise, yeah, they're up there. But even then, Lee loses, 30% of his army at Gettysburg? Lee doesn't capture an army during the Gettysburg campaign. He captures one in the Maryland campaign. But here's the thing. Let's say the Confederates, let's do a counterfactual. I always go through this rigmarole. This you can find in Alan Gelzo's Gettysburg Last Invasion. If anyone's listening to this, I know it's a bit of a controversial book. Personally, I'm hooked. Maybe that makes me an idiot, but I think he makes a fantastic argument. I don't know. Fight me. So at the end of the day, he's smarter than I am. But Gelzo makes a really interesting case that hypothetically, if the Confederates, here's the situation of the Confederates. So Pennsylvania and New York, this is 63, just to be clear. Pennsylvania and New York are holding gubernatorial elections. And at this point, there's no polling. Like polling doesn't really exist in the 1960s. But based on the newspapers, the general trend was the peace Democrats were going to win. Pennsylvania and New York are two of the most important states for the Union war effort. They're up there with Ohio for the number of regiments. Pennsylvania, New York, and Ohio produce more regiments than any other states, right? If the peace Democrats win in those two states, you're not going to have a lot of recruitment from either of those states. In fact, you might have a total suspension of any military support, right? This is massive. Lincoln will say of the gubernatorial elections of 63, he says, I am more anxious over this election than I was the election of 1860, right? This is massive. On top of that, no one can know this yet, but we're going to have the New York draft riots on July the 13th. The people of New York went, especially the Irish, went beast mode when they saw the list of casualties coming out of a Union victory. Imagine, because it was that and the draft. Imagine what happens if the draft is initiated in New York City and an even longer casualty list emerges, along with news of a brutal defeat and the federal army in full retreat into Maryland. Imagine the size of the riot then. And there are no federal troops to be dispatched to put it down because they're retreating along with General Meade. But don't worry, it gets worse because the only mobile army that is within range to do anything about the draft riot is your friendly local neighborhood army of Northern Virginia, which can arrive just as the rioters are shrieking, God bless Jeff Davis. That is called a disaster.
Wow. The only army that can put down and have authority would be the Confederate Army.
Yeah. What are you going to send? The Army of Susquehanna? A bunch of militia? Or how about the Washington garrison? You can't because Lincoln's bête noire is losing Washington. The only time in the entire war he's going to dispatch them is to support Grant when he believes, erroneously, that Grant has Lee's army entirely locked down at Petersburg. Turns out a slippery little corridor, General Early, is going to prove that wrong. But to quote Colonel Rhodes, Early was late and didn't take advantage of it. But thank Lew Wallace for the Battle of Monocacy. This is the 64 campaign. But my point is, you have a serious counterfactual problem at Gettysburg as well. Now at Gettysburg, you have the likelihood of foreign recognition, not so much because the British were particularly obsessed with the control of ports. Of course, they're a naval power, and whatever happens at Gettysburg, you're still going to lose Vicksburg. And by losing Vicksburg, you lose the Mississippi, which means the avenue of trade through Mexico to France has been severely diminished because that was, a lot of people don't know this, but one of a major Confederate avenue of trade was to monarchist Franco-Mexico after, I don't know if you're familiar with the Franco-Mexican War, but after Maximilian and the French had taken over Mexico through the rather interestingly named Baghdad, Mexico, trade was facilitated a good deal into the Confederacy there. Taking the Mississippi River allows you to strengthen the blockade and begin to cut off that trade. By the way, a little fun fact, the United States colored troops would actually intervene in the Franco-Mexican War in 1864 in the Battle of Baghdad. in order to recapture it for the Juaristas, which I think is a kind of a neat little thing. But so would that have canceled out the victory at Gettysburg in terms of gaining foreign recognition? I think probably, but I can't possibly say. So if you're talking high watermark for foreign recognition, I think 62 is undoubtedly the high watermark. Or maybe it's 1861 November in the Trent Affair, where the British came within a hair's breadth of telling Canada that we're at war with the Union. Which would have sucked, because that would have been pretty shameful for our country. But maybe it's 62. But if we're looking at political instability, I'd say it's 63. So but this is the problem with counterfactuals, right? You go to we're blue in the face.
So, final analysis on Sharpsburg.
I think it was pretty crazy.
On Lee's behalf, or?
No, I think the whole thing was nuts. 20,000 people in a day, like Jesus. But all facetious jokes aside, I think Lee had good reason to take the operational initiative. I think ultimately Lee's entire strategy is audacious. If you want to summarize it in its simplest terms, to steal a phrase from Steve Schmidt during the McCain campaign, he told John McCain, I would rather lose by 10 points trying to win than lose by 1 point trying not to lose. Right? However, when he was saying this, it was urging McCain to take Governor Sarah Palin as his running mate. And that analogy, I think, pretty much is the answer to your question.
So let me ask you, Sir. So Lee retreats back, and why wait until 2 more battles and to go north again? Why not regroup and try to take the initiative instead of letting Burnside move?
Partly because Davis really wasn't excited about another massive risk. Davis wasn't thrilled about Antietam. The fact that, remember, Davis never sends a letter to Lee saying, this is a great idea. I'm so excited. I'm so thrilled that our army could be destroyed, but, quote, it's not impossible to win. You do you. Instead, he doesn't respond, which is basically as close to saying no as he can. The reason he doesn't is Lee is fought by a wide margin, the best general he's had, and the only general that he had a good working relationship with outside of Albert Sidney Johnston. And Albert Sidney Johnston at that time was, shall we say, he was occupationally encumbered by being dead. So he doesn't want to say no to Lee. After Maryland, no. The other problem is, of course, Lee himself takes a hard drubbing. He's not in a position to take the initiative. And then couple that with the logistics. The Confederate winter of 1862 to 1863 was not great. The logistics were so terrible that, if you ever wonder why General Longstreet was not present at the Battle of Chancellorsville, it's because Lee had to dispatch Longstreet to Suffolk, Virginia, because he literally couldn't feed his entire army. So he basically has to send Longstreet to Independent Command to forage for himself. That's how bad the logistical situation is. So he's not in a logistical position to take operational offensive. It's also the winter. And Davis isn't thrilled about it either. He's essentially forced into a defensive. That doesn't mean that Lee lost the desire to attack. At Fredericksburg, his greatest regret is that he doesn't take the offensive after the battle, which McClellan thought he was going to do. In fact, horrifically, McClellan's 7th and 8th attacks on Mars Heights, when they were launched, General Franklin's aborted attack on Jackson's lines had already failed. It was no longer a demonstration. I'm assuming people listening to this are familiar with the fact that Mars Heights was a demonstration in order to break the Confederate right. At that point, Burnside had totally given up on that. He was just so terrified Lee was going to counterattack that he kept up the pressure while he withdrew his army. But Lee couldn't do so because the Federal guns at Stafford's Heights would have torn his men to shreds. So he was deeply regretful of the fact that his defensive victory didn't result in counterattack. Lee still wanted to attack, but he lacked the logistical support to do so. is not until after he drives the Federals out from Fredericksburg following Chancellorsville. It's also important to remember the Federals, they lose the Battle of Fredericksburg. They lose the town. They don't lose the position. They're still on Stafford's Heights. It's not until Chancellorsville that he's driven the Federals back sufficiently and they've withdrawn that he can retake the initiative. And that's going to get.
Let me ask you a couple questions that are kind of off topic here, but concerning Lee. Is this something that I guess somebody's born with? Lee, even when the battles that he lost, he had a keen ability to sense the objectives and what needed to be seized.
Yes.
Is that something that, is taught, or is that something that's just ingrained?
He didn't learn it at West Point, that's for sure. The West Point curriculum never, as far as I know, it never went beyond brigade tactics. One of the great myths of the Civil War is West Point graduates held high commands because they were trained for it. They weren't trained for it. They held high commands because of the West Point clique. In both armies, you either had to have the political importance or you had to have graduated from West Point, which is why a fun little game to play, if you're ever bored, is try to think of Civil War Army commanders who didn't graduate West Point. But it had nothing to do, like one or two. They're all political appointees. Although, in fairness, Black Jack was actually a pretty good general. But it really came down to West Point itself, its curriculum was mostly about science. But basically, West Point was a glorified engineering school. Its curriculum was largely based on science, the arts, horseback riding. And then if you have the chance, maybe a little bit of tactics here and there. Because the purpose of West Point was not to create massive armies. America didn't have a massive army until the Civil War. And they would disband it. America doesn't have a massive permanent army until after World War II. The America as the hegemonic dominating force of the world is a fairly new thing. America's always been an imperialist nation, but it was a smaller imperialism. But the purpose was to establish a professional class of officers. Basically, before West Point, the military is a drag position. The U.S. doesn't even have a regular army until after the War of 1812. The whole purpose of West Point was to give officers the credibility of professionals. It's no different from any other professionalized college. Where I live, Ontario, we have the Ontario College of Teachers, which I'm a proud member. The purpose of the Ontario College of Teachers is that in Canada, or Ontario, especially Ontario, unlike, no offense, but unlike some parts of the world, teachers are actually respected as professionals because we have a professional class. That was the whole point of West Point, was to create a professional camaraderie of officers. But they go into the war with brigade level training, which is based off of the War of 1812. Which never got really beyond the brigade level. The most successful invasion of the War of 1812 by the United States was at least in terms of if we're talking football, in terms of, score points, was the invasion of Niagara of 1814. And ultimately, General Brown's force was Eliza Ripley and Scott. It's like 2 brigades, right? So it wasn't that big.
The other question I want to ask you,
just to finish that point. That's a problem. If you look at the beginning of the Civil War, there are no divisions. It's just brigade command. The Battle of Manassas, the army is 8 brigades. There's no divisions. Then you get divisional command. And then we start seeing division level tactics. We don't start seeing corps level tactics until the war is already more than a year old. The rebels don't officially adopt the corps system until after the Battle of Antietam. Unofficially, Lee splits the army into a left and right wing, into grand divisions, which is functionally corps, but you don't start seeing corps level decisions until, as it happens, to bring us back to where we started this conversation, the Second Manassas Campaign, which is the first campaign where the Confederates, at least in the Eastern Department, are using what could be described as corps level tactics. And for the federal armies, they organized the corps system before and during the Urbana campaign. McClellan is incredibly resistant to it. But it's really not until 62 we begin to see corps level command. And it's really by late 62 we begin to see actual corps level tactics because the officers are working their way up from being taught brigade level. So I guess my very long answer to your question is I guess Lee was born with it. I don't know. I'm not a genius, but he was. And the same would be true of Grant and Sherman. They sure as hell didn't learn it at West Point.
So, and the last one is, I guess, is something probably born with too. Lee had an ability to, see what his opponent was going to do next. Is that something that's born into somebody?
Oh, 100%. I think, and it's not just that, because, I mean, hypothetically, you could see what your opponent's going to do, but not act on it. Like, take me, for example. I'm a butterball. I'm always reluctant. I'm politically very left, but I'm conservative by nature. Move slowly and cautiously. That's not how Lee thought. Lee's entire perspective on warfare is best summarized in what he said to Davis. The army might be destroyed, but I do not think victory is impossible. For someone like me, that is a phenomenal reason to not do this. For someone like Lee, that's a good enough reason to do it. Because Lee's perspective is, I'd rather lose by 10 points trying to win than lose by 1 point trying not to lose. So that is temperament. So yeah, Lee could have an innate ability to understand what his opponent's going to do. That's fantastic. I think that's really genuinely incredible. But what makes someone like Lee or Grant or Sherman truly brilliant is the temperament that allows them to act on that instinct, an initiative. And that is what completes a brilliant commander, at least as far as I understand it. As Clausewitz said, military brilliance, that's nice. Temperament, yeah, that matters.
All right. My man, I think that's all the questions I've got. Anything else you want to add?
No, it was a lot of fun. Just to be clear, I've been praising Lee a lot. Just want to reinforce this for anyone who might be listening, especially if they love Lee, just to irritate them. Lee was good, Grant was better.
But you are one of the people who, I get so tired in these groups listening to people bash Grant, bash Lee.
Oh.
I mean, and get these pissing contests. It's no doubt those were two of the finest generals ever to come out of West Point.
Well, I mean, they're on different levels, in my opinion. I tend to borrow John Keekstra's system. It's straightforward. I like it. He proposes a 5-tier system to classify commanders in the Civil War, or I guess really anywhere. And you could apply this beyond, armchair generalship. You have tier 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Tier 5 are generals that are so terrible that they actively aid the enemy. So General Roger Pryor and his inability to get his division to the sunken road because the map was just a bit too much for him is a tier 5 general. Now, in Roger Pryor's defense, he would resign his commission, re-enlist as a private, and serve the rest of the war as an enlisted man, which actually is genuinely, I don't like the Confederates, but I do actually admire that sense of decency, of self-awareness. Right, so you got your tier 5 generals. Another tier 5 general, I might cautiously argue Leonidas Polk, who never saw a bad decision he didn't fall in love with. Then you have your tier 4 generals, and they're not terrible, but they're not particularly useful either. So General Burnside, to me, is a tier 4. I don't quite put him in tier 5. I get why people do, but you got to remember at New Bern and Knoxville, he demonstrated that with a small command, he wasn't awful. And he was one of the best brigade performers at the Battle of Manassas. So, got to give him some credit. Then you have your tier 3s. Your tier 3s are good, reliable. These are rare, right? These are men who you put them in action, it's going to go okay. Longstreet, to me, is a tier 3. Maybe tier 2. I put him in tier 3. Uncle John Sedgwick is a tier 3 to me. Right? Then you have your tier 2s. And your tier 2s are generals who are actually exceptionally brilliant. Very rare level of innate sense of what to do. Thomas Jonathan Jackson is a tier 2. Robert E. Lee is a tier 2. George Thomas is a tier 2. Really amazing generals. And then you have your tier 1. And these are generals who are so brilliant that they change, alter, and redefine the rules of warfare. They create entirely new doctrines and apply those doctrines by thinking flexibly. And there's only 2 in the Civil War, Grant and Sherman.
All right, well, let me ask you this. I think campaign strategy, Grant, by far. But if you're going to take a general in a one-on-one battle with tactics, who would you take?
My response to that is find me a war that is a one-on-one battle based on tactics.
Okay, that's fair enough.
But if you're asking me, I would say Lee can command my principal army, but Grant's going to be giving him orders. Grand strategy, operations, tactics. And Lee was an amazing operational commander as well. Grand strategy, I mean, the Confederates never really had one. I'm looking at outcomes, right? As for a toss-up fight, I will also plant my flag on this. We'll never know whether Grant or Lee was a better tactical fighter, because did they ever really have a tactical fight?
It was a brawl. Every one of their fights were just...
The Wilderness is a soldier's fight, right? There's no tactical command there. It's just hip-thigh assault back and forth.
Lee did pull off two good flank attacks.
But that's accidental, right? Like, there's no command and control. It's just pure luck, and most battles are pure luck anyway. And then we get for the rest of the battles. I mean, frankly, Lee is hiding behind fortifications. Now, this is where I get irritated with this kind of thing. People will say, "Oh, well, if General Grant fought one soldier to one soldier, Lee would win." Or someone might say, "Well, if Lee wasn't behind his entrenchments, he would have won." Yeah, but why would they do that? That's stupid. No one goes into battle asking themselves, hey, is this fair? No, you want to make it as unfair as possible because you want to win. So Lee did the smart thing by entrenching, and Grant did the smart thing by not letting up. But ultimately, who could maneuver troops better on a chessboard? Well, we never got to find out. But to me, it's immaterial. Both of them had the resources they had and the context they had. Both took their best advantage of it, and ultimately one of them got the gold medal, and one of them ended up becoming a headmaster at a small college in Lexington.
Good point.
Yeah. Sorry. That's why I'm not in the Army. I like getting silver medals. They don't give them out. They don't give them out in war.
I love tactics. I mean, that's one of my favorite things. Some of Lee's.
Sorry? Oh, I think you froze. We still recording? Maybe. Tactics are fun. They're a lot of fun. It's just, it depends on what we're analyzing. They're interesting. The other issue I'd have with tactics is, and I mean, I can't pretend to be an authority on this, but realistically, in a battle with 80,000 men on each side, 100,000 men on each side, and especially when battle is joined and it's so chaotic and so smoke-filled that even a colonel commanding a regiment doesn't really know what's in front of him. Can you realistically expect any officer to actually exercise command and control to a point that we can assess their tactical ability? I mean, at some level, maybe we could bring back the ghosts of General Grant and General Lee and put them in a versus match on Ultimate General Civil War. It'd be really interesting to watch what happens, but that's not a reflection of real life. Lee himself at the Gettysburg campaign would say,